brother was a toddler, and of course I wasn't around at that point. He developed rheumatic fever. I've never even heard of it. Have no idea. I don't think it's around now, or they have ways of dealing with it. But he darn near died, from what I understand, from the disease. And he was stricken with it, and it damaged his heart muscle. And damaged it pretty badly at this stage of the game. So you will see at this stage of the game. So the next slide you would have seen was my brother in his Army uniform doing what he did most of the time when he was in the military, and that was guard duty. He was not in what you call combat, but he was guard duty. And when he got to England, they were in a remote camp at the stage of the game, and he was pulling guard duty. But he had heard rumors that some colonel would come around and check on them, and if he could get close enough to the guards and be able to grab their rifle, the people were in deep trouble at that stage of the game. So Bob sort of knew about this, and one day a Jeep came up, and he's on guard duty, and he looked, and this colonel got out of the Jeep and started walking up towards Bob. And Bob said, "No, I know what he's up to." And he got within 10 feet of Bob, and my brother took his rifle and pointed it at him and said, "Sir, you take one more step, and I'm going to shoot you."
Wow.
Okay? And the colonel took him as very serious that he was going to do this. And he asked Bob, he said, "What would you do if a couple Germans, soldiers, came up this thing?" And Bob said, "I'd take this rifle and I'd throw it down and I'd run." And he can't run, but he just said he would run. He stays the game. And the colonel said, "Son, why would you say that?" He said, "Sir, the only thing we have in these guns are blanks. They didn't give us real live ammunition." So, I did go through that sort of thing. Now, when Bob was in school, Hitler was coming to power in Europe, and most of you know from your school that he would start taking little big pieces of land, especially lands that had German-speaking people, like Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And the powers to be at that stage of the game basically tried to reason with him. Remember, Chamberlain went to England, and they all said, "If you please don't take anything else, you won't do this or that type of thing." And of course, Hitler didn't care what they said, because he had a pretty idea what he was going to do anyway at that stage of the game. So basically, Hitler finally decided he wanted Poland, and he went into Poland. And of course, he had this blitzkrieg type of warfare that he was practicing. But Poland had already made an agreement with the French and the English that if the Germans attacked them, that they would come to Poland's aid. Well, needless to say, the English and the French were forced to live up to their agreement, and they declared war on Poland when Hitler went in and took it at that stage of the game. That's when England, living up to its agreement, sent 300,000 troops into France to help fight this. They assumed that the French were going to help at that stage of the game, but we'll see what happened in a second. So the British sent an army in. The French surrendered, unsurprised to anybody, in 1939 at that stage of the game. My brother was 16 years old at that time, so I don't think he was real patriotic at that particular moment in time. Bob, my brother, from what I understand, did not like school. Okay? His favorite class was printing shop. I didn't even know they had a printing shop in Turkey. You know, when I was in school, I loved the wood shop, that stage of the game. But he loved printing. And later in life, he became a master printer and ran big printing presses and all that sort of stuff. So he got this inkling of it in school. Now, President Roosevelt back in that day was keenly aware that the American people were opposed to getting involved in European affairs. They had just finished, you know, World War I, and the Americans wanted no part of getting into Europe at this stage of the game. Roosevelt, being a politician, knew that, and basically he ran what we call, you know, an isolationist foreign policy. But he also was smart enough to realize that what was going on in Europe was eventually going to bite us. And we were going to get into it one way or the other. So he quietly started trying to build up the American military forces. Now remember, just coming off of World War I, we had basically no army left. They dissolved most of it. The equipment was outdated at that stage of the game. So basically, there was no real contest at that stage of the game. And Roosevelt also tried to help the British by sending, you know, remember from American history, Lend-Lease materials to the British, you know, destroyers, old destroyers and boats that we had no use for at this stage of the game. So Roosevelt realized eventually we were going to get into it at that stage of the game. Now, also the Germans had their submarine fleet at this time, and they started sinking American ships. And, you know, everybody thought that that would be the key that would get us in, but no. They were sinking ships, even in passenger ships. They said if they carried any kind of goods to England, they were fair game at that stage of the game. So it was a matter of time until we were going to get into it anyway at that stage of the game. Now, most of you are aware of the fact that when the British sent their 300,000 troops into France, the Germans were already conquered most of France and the rest of the country, and they had these huge tank corps out there, and the British were forced, since France surrendered, to want to get out, and so they moved all of their troops as fast as they could back to the beach in what town? Dunkirk. And so you had 300,000 troops on this little beach, and the Germans were, you know, prepared to take it at this stage of the game. Now, Hitler has made numerous blunders throughout the war. And one of the blunders I think he made was the fact that he could have crushed the British 300,000 troops easily, but he didn't. He kept them back, and eventually, you know, Dunkirk occurred, and the British brought in every kind of boat that had a motor, little boats, big boats, to try to get these 300,000 troops off. And we have a picture of showing you where all these boats.
We're showing it.
You're showing it?
Yeah.
At this stage, At this time, Hitler makes an alliance with the Japanese, because the Japanese were becoming very warlike in Asia. So they make an alliance, and then what dictator joined them? Mussolini of Italy. And Hitler then made a deal with what other dictator? Stalin. Okay, at the stage of the game. So the United States is still practicing this isolationist package, but the world is becoming quite involved with the dictators at this stage of the game. Now, at this time, Japan and the United States were at loggerheads in Asia. The Japanese were getting very ballistic and militaristic, and the United States cut off oil shipments to them, and, that was a tantamount to the fact that they were going to go to war, but we still haven't had war at this stage of the game. Now, on December 7th, 1941, Japan decided that it couldn't go any longer with the United States, that they had to take them on. And so they did a surprise attack and attacked Pearl Harbor. And most of you are familiar with, what happened, the pictures in terms of this. What was the ship that got sunk with about 1,200?
Arizona.
The Arizona, and it's still there to see. It's one of my things that I would love to go see, but I doubt very much if I ever get to Hawaii to see it at that stage of the game. Now, one of the Japanese warlords who was on one of their carriers that came to Pearl Harbor told some of his lower level officers, he said, "We are about to wake a tiger." Okay? And he was quite correct. He knew once we bit, the tiger was going to come and bite back at this stage of the game. Now, when Pearl Harbor was struck, most people are not aware of the fact is that the Japanese failed to hit what?
Refinery.
Aircraft carriers.
The aircraft carriers. If the Japanese had actually hit our carriers, we might be speaking Japanese. Right at this moment, that war could have been extremely different at that stage of the game. So, fortunately, the 4 carriers that we had were out on maneuvers, and the Japanese didn't know where they were, so they didn't attack them, but they got most of our battleships and cruisers and destroyers and did a lot of damage, but they also angered a lot of Americans. Guess what? The isolationist policy disappeared real fast, and now most Americans wanted to go and get the Japanese. Now, soon after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt gave a speech before Congress, and basically he said that this was going to be December 7th was going to be a date that would live in infamy, and that stage of the game. So immediately, Congress declares war on Japan. Now, since Japan and Germany had an alliance, the Germans did what?
Declared war.
They declared war on the United States. So we were now at war, but the problem is we were at war on 2 fronts. And that's something you normally don't want to get involved in terms of having to, create 2 armies at this stage of the game. But the war is on at this stage of the game. Let me just go. Now, at this stage of the game, Roosevelt asked almost all of the American industries, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, to do what? Build military equipment. And now consumer goods in the United States almost completely disappeared, and actually much of what was going on in the United States was rationing. No more cars, no more tires, and years later, I was, I guess, about 5 or 6, I was curious. I went up in our attic, and I'm roaming around in there, and I see this big tin. And so I take the lid off this tin, and guess what was in there?
Rations.
3 or 4 bags of sugar. My parents, rationed it, and then they forgot about that they had it. The war was over.
That was Wendell's grandmother. She had enough sugar for Sussex County.
At this time, the draft has already been passed, and so they start drafting all of these men to fight in the military. That created a problem for the industries. How did they solve it? Right, women came to the forefront. And if it hadn't been for women stepping up to the plate, I don't know where we might have been at this stage of the game, because we would not have been able to produce the goods. And of course, you hear the thing, Rosie the
Riveter,
at this
yeah.
stage of the game. So women can do almost anything that men can do if given the opportunity to do it at that stage of the game. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor was the catalyst that spurred my brother, who had just turned 17, to enlist. Now, he was not the only one. Many 17-year-olds all wanted to go and get the Japanese to stage the game. And it's very similar to what recently happened with the Twin Towers. When the terrorists hit those, a lot of people, young people, particularly 17, 18-year-old, they all want to join up and go get whom? Bin Laden. They go chasing down and killing at this stage of the game. So this is what happened. You know, a lot of 17-year-olds came to the forefront, and my brother was one of them. Now, I do not understand why, but he decided he wanted to be in the Navy. We did not live near the ocean. As far as I know, he never been on a boat, but he decided he wanted to be in the Navy. Now, one thing is that the Navy, to get into it, you had to volunteer. There's no enlisting to get into the Navy. But I'm not sure what his motivation was, but he did that. He went through, got to pass all of the tests in terms of that, and the last thing he had to do was visit the doctor. So the Navy doctor listened to his heart and said, "Young fellow," he said, "we appreciate you making an effort to join us, but your heart is so badly damaged, you cannot serve in terms of this." And I think he was heartbroken because he really wanted to serve at this stage of the game. But he had heard rumors that the Army was not quite as restrictive in its policies at this stage of the game. So he decided, "Oh, I'm gonna go give it a shot." And he got into a line to enlist in the Army. And of course, he went through the same tests, and he told me that there was a whole line of big, strong dudes waiting to get there, and they got to the point where they got shots, needles, and he said it was amazing the number of these big guys just passing out. He said, "I didn't pass out," but he said, "I saw quite a few of them bite the dust at that stage of the game." So he went to the Army, and I'm assuming they heard his heart, and they knew that he was defective at that stage of the game. But they told him, they said, "We're in such short supply of manpower to do things besides non-combat things that we will find a spot for you." So they decided to do this, and they said, you have to wait until you turn 18, and you can enlist on March 1st of 1943, and that's what he did. And they said on March 12th you are to report for basic training at Fort Jackson, which is in what state? South Carolina. So that's where he went for basic training.
There he is. Can you see him?
Now, I honestly believe that the Army did this deliberately, because normally, for those of you that have been in there, when you go to basic training, you get a big heavy pack of something on your back, and they say, "Get up at 5 o'clock or something in the morning, and we're going for a little jog of like 25 miles. Well, that would have killed Bob, with his bad heart. So I think that they had a special camp where they didn't put him through all the rigorous things that the normal combat soldier had to go through at that stage of the game. So basically, he went to Fort Jackson and did that. See.
You want a chair?
He was now, 18, and as I mentioned, he was in, Fort Jackson in terms of this. And I already said that about basic training, I think he had a reduced, basic training program at that stage of the game. Now, while he was in basic training, he was assigned to a company in the military, and it was the 39th Quartermaster Gasoline Supply Company. I've never heard of it at the stage of the game, but its job was to supply tanks, with gasoline in combat stations at this stage of the game. So that was his job, and then for 4 more months, he was chasing after the 4th Army Division, which was still in the United States in Kentucky and Tennessee, practicing for the going to England and in the invasion, this stage of the game. So that's what he was doing. All right. Now, and after training, I'm not sure how much training you need to do, because basically they had 5-gallon cans of gasoline that they had to fill and then pour it into the tank at this stage of the game. They didn't have, pumps to deal with at this stage of the game. So he was there. Now, at this point, he was transferred to Fort Miles Standish in Massachusetts to do a little bit more training, and then they were moved to Boston Harbor, where they boarded a ship called the USS Explorer, the stage of the game. Okay? And it was going to take them to England. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story. As you know, when the troops were taken across to England to fight, they had to go by convoys. And a convoy is basically a group of unarmed ships that's go this way, and destroyers do a circle around them to protect them, because the German submarines were at their peak at this stage of the game. And Bob's ship broke down. That's not a good place to break down out in the ocean. And I guess they got it fixed and going again, but it broke down again and it lost one of the diesel engines. And of course, I guess it had one engine, it was losing speed, and eventually it fell out of the, area where the destroyers could protect it at this stage of the game. They were sitting ducks for the German U-boats at this stage of the game. And Bob said that at that point in the Atlantic, a storm came up. And he said it was a horrible storm. He said even the sailors on the ship, were having a difficult time with us at this stage of the game. And Bob said that on the ship, everybody but him got sick. They were vomiting. He said there was vomit all over the hallways, the rooms, everywhere at this stage of the game. He said it stunk like heck, and it was bad at this stage of the game. But, if you've ever seen TV shows with the submarines and the periscope comes up, and if you notice that every time the periscope comes up, water drips off, and the ocean's pristine. And you can see the ship out there, and they can measure in terms of how fast it's going, so know how to fire the torpedoes, etc. But if you're in a storm, big storm, no matter how big the ship is, it's going to be picked up by the waves. And they will, the Germans, first place, you can't see it because the waves are, even if they could fire a torpedo, the chances are the ship, when it gets up to the peak, okay, the torpedo would go right underneath of it at this stage of the game. So, for whatever reason, the Germans did not sink this ship. And eventually it crawled into Ireland. But as it got close to the English area, the British planes then took over circulating and watched them and guided these ships in to protect them from the submarines. So Bob basically got into Ireland and they disembarked, and then they were put on a train and taken to northern England, some remote base. They basically kept the American troops pretty isolated from the British at that stage of the game. So we have that. Now, when Bob was in England, he was 18, he turned 18, and he was so excited because he could get a beer. But, you know, they kept him isolated for so long. Eventually, they gave him R&R, go to a local town and a pub. So he goes in, and the first thing he does, he goes up to the bar, and he asks the bartender, "Can I have a pint of beer?" And the bartender said to him, "How old are you, son?" "I'm 18. "I'm sorry, you have to be 21 to drink." Now, standing at the bar at this time is a British sergeant major. Now, if you know anything about the British Army, you know, they are the heart of it at this stage of the game. And this guy is standing there, and he's got the big mustache and all that sort of thing. He overheard the bartender tell Bob, "I'm sorry, you can't have a drink." And he said, I guess he knew the bartender because he probably there a lot. And the bartender came over, and he said to him, he said, "This young man is old enough to come over here and die for us. He's old enough to have a beer." And the bartender wasn't going to argue with the sergeant major. And so Bob got his beer. But the problem is that Bob liked the beer. It was a little too much at this stage of the game. And he got, I guess, disruptive or something, and the military police came and picked him up and I guess put him in a Jeep and took him back to his camp and told his boss, commander, and he then ended up doing one of his jobs, which we don't have, I don't know if we have the picture of it, is KP duty, peeling potatoes. He said he peeled more potatoes in his life in the Army at that stage of the game. So he's now in England, and he's training for D-Day, this stage of the game. Now, at this time, General Eisenhower, who's head of Operation Overlord, realizes that a number of the troops that are going to go into D-Day have never been in combat. Now, many of them have, because a lot of the soldiers had fought in North Africa and then Sicily. But like Bob and many others who had never been in combat, so Eisenhower decided that he wanted to create an exercise to give these young guys a taste of what is about to come at this stage of the game. So this is where Operation Tiger comes in, that most of you have never heard of at this stage of the game. So they got 8 LSTs lined up, and these young guys got on these LSTs, which are big ships that carry troops, tanks, whatever they are, and they were going to create an exercise where the ships were going to go at a certain time down through the English Channel into a beach called Slapton Sands, and then it was a beach just like the beaches in Normandy at the stage of the game, and then they were going to just put the troops down and let them crawl up on the beach. And the British ships, the big ships, were out in the Body border, and they were going to fire live ammunition onto this beach. And British had soldiers up on the hilltop, and they had machine guns, and they were going to fire this. So these 8 LSTs are lining up. Now remember, my brother was on LST 511, which doesn't mean anything to you, but he was carrying 1 million gallons of gasoline in terms of this. So they're out there, and they would be protected by 2 destroyers. One of the destroyers hit something on the way out, and basically had to go back into port. And they called for another one, but it never got there in time at this stage of the game. So it left one destroyer and a little British Corvair ship out there. And for some reason, Germans either knew they were there or just happened to run into them, but a whole fleet of German E-boats, which are like our American PT boats that John Kennedy piloted, they came out and they carried torpedoes and machine guns. And they see these 8 ships. Now, first place, 8 ships in a line is wrong. It's against military rule. They're supposed to be zigzagging at this stage of the game, but they were all lined up. And these German E-boats saw an easy target, and so they start shooting, firing torpedoes at them. And the commander of Bob's LST said to Bob, "I know you got a marksman medal when you were in basic training." He said, "Get up there, that machine gun, and start firing at them and hit one of them at this stage of the game." And Bob looked at him and said, "Sir, I'll go up." But he said, "It's not going to do me any good." He said, "That machine gun is loaded with blanks." Okay? And the German ships were not loaded, they had this. And while he's up there, he saw one of these torpedoes go right in front of the bow of his ship. And it went over and it hit the next one. And at this stage of the game. Now, can you imagine if his got hit with 1 million gallons of gasoline on it? He wouldn't have been in D-Day at that stage of the game. They'd have been all incinerated at that stage of the game. Now, the results of this attack, okay, was 2 LSTs were sunk, and a third was badly damaged at this stage of the game. And, you know, the ships that were hit, many of the men jumped overboard to get away from flames and various other things. Prior to them going out, they had all been issued a new flotation device, some kind of belt, at this stage of the game. The only problem was they forgot to tell the guys how to use it. And when many of them were jumping into the water, they couldn't get the belt over their backpack at this stage of the game. And the device didn't work right, and it actually flipped a lot of the soldiers so that instead of being on their backs, their face was in the water. And a lot of them drowned at this stage of the game. And many others, you know, died of hypothermia because this was April and the English Channel was still pretty cold at this stage of the game. And there was no rescue attempt at this stage of the game. 749 American people were killed at this stage of the game. And then, to make matters a little bit worse, 2 of the LSTs decided to make a run for it and go to the beach where they were supposed to, you know, unload their troops. But the British and the Americans did not have communications. They couldn't communicate with each other. And so when these LSTs came to the beach, the British were firing live ammunition onto the beach. And about another 300 troops were killed in terms of, you know, that attack at that stage of the game. Okay. So it's about 1,000 young people. Now the military was so embarrassed by this that they decided that they had to keep this quiet. So they actually had trucks brought in and they put all the bodies in there. A lot of British citizens saw this, so they know that, you know, these were actually there. And they took them and buried them someplace in England in a secret cemetery at this stage of the game. And then, you know, I believe what they did was that when D-Day actually occurred, they actually sent home notices of the death of the person that from the invasion of D-Day, but they actually died in this, you know, exercise, which was just a horrible big mistake at this stage of the game. So it was quite a disaster at that stage of the game. Now, we have one in the next picture. is, I just wanted to let you know my brother was a normal male, and he liked to look at the French girls and the British girls at the stage of the game, so he had in a scrapbook that his son gave me to, help prepare this talk, that he had a lot of pictures of women in terms of that. Now, prior to D-Day, actually, which was 6 weeks down the road from this Operation Tiger, this stage of the game, Bob was assigned to what is called the Engineers Special Beach Brigade, and we have a picture of some of them that were doing it. Its job was to clear the beaches of tank traps that the Germans had placed there and other things at this stage of the game. But the problem is that when they put him in this thing, he was then going to be one of the first ones to come into the D-Day invasion in terms of off the boats. Now, if you know anything about these, they come in on LSTs, and those LSTs are carrying troops, tanks, and other military equipment. And if you look at one of them, they are big ships. They're about a football length in size. The troops are on there, and when they go into the beach, they come down a rope ladder on the side and drop into a small little boat called a Higgins boat. Okay? And the Higgins boat then reels them in to the beach in terms of where they are going. In terms of this. But I want to mention one other thing. On the beach, Utah Beach, there was only about 200 men killed, and 1,000 were killed in that exercise. Now, right down to the other beach, Omaha Beach was, and about 2,500 Americans died coming in because the German troops that they had out there to protect from the invasion were much more advanced than were. Because the Utah Beach, when they started coming in, the current, somebody forgot to calculate this, but the boats, the Higgins boats, were carried a mile further down the beach, and basically they were at the very end of what the Germans had built up, along this. Remember, the Germans actually built from Norway all the way through France because they didn't know exactly where the invasion was going. And this is one of the other blunders that Hitler made. Hitler was convinced that the invasion was going to be in Calais, which is the very northern part of France, the closest part to England. And he had 2 reserve Panzer tank divisions sitting there waiting to go, and they would have crushed the invasion troops very easily. But Hitler was, his generals wouldn't argue with him, and he was determined that's where the invasion was going to be. So even when this invasion took place, he was convinced that it was a ruse, that it wasn't the real thing, and he wouldn't allow his generals to release the Panzer tanks. They eventually ran into these Panzer divisions when they got off the beach and coming through France. There was about 220,000 Americans killed trying to get through those divisions and the German troops that were there at this stage of the game. I want to just tell you about one thing. You have a picture of what the invasion looks like when they come in. These boats are supposed to come in and actually go out and land on the beach, or at least you get close, and like maybe a foot of water. So when Bob's little boat, the Higgins boat, was coming in, and they were in the 3rd wave, the guy that was driving the boat, the machine gun fire coming off the cliff was so intense, and I guess he didn't like this, so he said, "To hell with this." He suddenly just let the gate down front, and the troops are always shown that when that gate goes down, you run and get onto the beach. Well, my brother was like 5'2", And when they went down and they ran, the water was over 6 feet high. And so he sank like a rock because they had, you know, all ammunition, food and all this, his rifle and all that. And he immediately threw his rifle away, took his backpack off and everything else that he could do to lighten him, and then he popped up. And fortunately, one of his buddies from, you know, the basic training thing was over 6 feet, and he was able to grab Bob and held him up until they could walk him in to where he could get his feet on the beach at this stage of the game. So he got in, and I asked Bob, I said, well, who were you? And I said, you didn't have a rifle, you had no ammunition? He said, not a problem. There were rifles everywhere, bodies, even though it was only 200 killed, that's still in an area, you know, quite a few. And he said the water was red from the wounded and dead. In stage game, he said, I found, you know, weapon very, very quickly. And he's not supposed to have been in combat. And he eventually crawled from the tank trap until he got up to where the wall of the cliff was. And of course the Germans couldn't fire down at it because they were firing out this way, the stage game. And Bob said, I got thirsty. And so he said, I reached for my canteen, pulled it out, and he said, damn, this is light. He said, I know I filled it on that boat just before we got off of it. And he looked at it, and right through the mid thing was a bullet hole. So that's how close he came to being one of the casualties at that stage of the game. Now, at that stage of the game, the first waves that went into the beach were the 4th Army Division Rangers. And their job was to find a way to blow a road through that cliff up to the top so they could get up and deal with the German machine guns and that. And so how they did it, I don't know, but they blew holes in it. Eventually, they were able to get up there and eliminate most of the German machine gunners. And they said that they went, next, they had these pillboxes made out of concrete. And the Rangers went and they were going to throw, you know, explosives in there. They found almost all of them were empty. No guns, no troops. So that's why the casualty rate was a lot less in terms of that. So that's pretty much, you know, in terms of D-Day invasion at this stage of the game. And by the way, my brother did come home alive at the stage of the game.
I have a question. How many of you here have been to that beachhead over there? Anybody?
No.
We're going in May. That's why we're here. But we
Yeah.
haven't been
Two of
yet.
my softball team went.
Have you been?
I've roamed around there a fair amount too, and it's just something else. We actually went into one of the pillboxes where they had one of these guns. The enemy did, and it was all fragmented from ammunition on our side, but those were poor guys having to crawl and enemy fire. It was terrible.
Now, I was about to go to the Normandy, and I got COVID or something struck and we couldn't go. But from what I've seen in pictures, it's impressive. You see all those white crosses in a perfect straight line. And you think they were live human beings who gave it all, you know, to fight and try to, you know, save this country at this stage of the game.
Yeah, when speaking of rheumatic fever, I had that when I was a little kid. So I can relate to what this young man went through in his youth. And my doctors from that point on followed my heart pulse and heart performance for 20, 30 years. And then I had it again when I was age 30. I had another bout, but they could take care of that now with medication. We're very fortunate.
How old would your brother be now?
Probably 101. I'm 85, so he's 16 years
Yeah.
older than I am at this stage of the game. So, you know, that takes us up to, you know, and I don't wanna bore you, keep you here, but, you know, he's gone onto the beach and is there, and they're coming off the beach, and, he's assigned to Patton's Third Army. And basically Patton tells his company, I want you to do nothing else but keep my tanks running. So, you know, the tanks would go out and have combat. And what Bob said, you know, this, I asked him, I said, how good was the German soldier? He said, they were excellent. He said they were highly disciplined, highly trained, and they fought tenaciously at this stage of the game. And he said even more so was the fact their equipment was so much better than America's. The German, you know, Tiger tank, Panzer tanks, just blew the Sherman tank. That the only thing that kept them going was the fact that as fast as the Germans could blow up our tanks, more were coming off the assembly line, and you know, you'd have 4 or 5 American tanks tanking on one German tank at this stage of the game. So Bob said their equipment, and eventually later on, the German airplanes, I'm being sure the American airplanes, far superior to the Germans, until the very end of the war, when the Germans developed most people not aware of this, a jet airplane. And this jet airplane was so fast that the Americans didn't have anything that could touch it. The only thing that happened was that the jet would run out of fuel very quickly and have to go back to its base. So the American planes would wait until they saw it going back to its base to get new fuel, and then they'd pounce on it at this stage of the game. At this stage of the game. But, you know, the Germans had far superior equipment until the latter stage of the war at that stage. You know, Now, when they were about to cross the Rhine River to go into Germany, Patton got called by Eisenhower. Said, I want you to come to my headquarters. And most people are aware of the fact that the Germans had snuck a whole fleet of Tiger tanks into the Belgium area, the Dardanelles, the forest region, and they were going to make a quick dash to conquer what port city and turn the course of the war.
Antwerp.
Somebody heard of it. What was the city?
Antwerp.
Antwerp is correct. But the Germans ran into the 101st Airborne, which was actually in the area on, you know, R&R, and they got caught into the middle of this at this stage of the game. And at a little town called Bastogne, the Americans were able to stop the Germans, and eventually the Germans sent a group of soldiers and officers in to tell them, you gotta surrender or we're gonna wipe you out and massacre you. And so when they brought these German officers in, they blindfolded them through the troops, the American troops, and they took them into General McCullough's headquarters, and basically they gave this ultimatum, and McCullough answered the Germans, how?
Nuts.
He said what?
Nuts.
Nuts. And the Germans didn't understand what that meant. So I think an American colonel or something that spoke German said, I'll translate for you. It means go to hell. We're not surrendering at this stage of the game. Now, at this point, Eisenhower had gotten Patton to stop from going to Germany, which he was furious, and he had to divert and go to Bastogne. And, in terms of getting to Bastogne, he said, it'll take me 48 hours. Well, he miscalculated. The Germans put up stiff resistance, and he did not make it until, after Christmas to stage the game, to get to relieve those troops to stage the game. Now, at that point, a major event occurred in the battle that changed the course of it. What was that?
Weather.
The weather. So suddenly they looked up and they saw blue sky, the snow stopped. And what that meant was that what could suddenly get involved? American and British airplanes. And they just decimated the Germans. They dropped all kinds of munitions, food, and all this type of thing. And then they just, and the Germans gave up their effort of getting to Antwerp, and they made a beeline to head back into Germany because they knew the war was heading in the wrong direction. And one other thing I just mentioned that when Patton got back to moving into Germany across the Rhine, all of a sudden Bob noticed that no tanks were coming back. And he said, all of a sudden, I could smell this horrible smell. Patton had run into Buchenwald, which was one of the concentration camps, and things were so bad that Patton they had to bring in special troops, doctors, nurses, people, to take care of the poor people that were still alive. They actually commandeered German citizens to come in and dig up the mass graves, to locate the bodies, to prepare, information for war trials against Hitler and his soldiers, generals, and this type of thing. So, that delayed them. And they moved further into Germany, and eventually Eisenhower called Patton again and said, George, you gotta stop. What do you mean I gotta stop? We have to let the Russians conquer Berlin. So Patton was not a happy camper in terms of that. But Bob basically spent time in Cologne, and I'll give you a little bit, in the city. There wasn't much left of German cities anywhere. Bob was in Cologne, and he saw this railroad, and it said Nippes on it. And I said, oh, okay. Well, Bob was mistaken. It wasn't the railroad, it was a railroad station in Cologne, a big one. It was named Nippes. And he came back and told me, this railroad. So I believed almost all of my life that I was German. I had German ancestry. I knew that half of me was English because my mother was born in England and came over here when she was 10, this stage of the game. So I used to tell everybody I'm German. And then my wife made me take a DNA test. And it came back, I was English, but I also was not German, Irish, heavy Irish. And I said, no, I'm not Irish, but my DNA, I said, well, it's a mistake. I'm not really German. But, at that stage of the game, Bob and his unit was put on a train or something and brought back to France, where they were put on another ship to be brought back to the United States. And, a lot of the troops were brought back by passenger, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth. The ship he came on, I wasn't sure it'd even make it to stage the game, but he got here, and then most of the troops were taken to New York and had ticker tape parades. His group was taken to Ellis Island and dropped off there. And then they were transferred to Indiantown Gap, where they did more training. then they were shipped to Wyoming, and then they were shipped to California to prepare to go in at the stadium. Now, most people did not know, even the government didn't really know, that there was a project going on called the Manhattan Project. And they had developed atomic bombs at the stage of the game. And Roosevelt goes to Georgia and dies at the stage of the game. And so Truman becomes, as vice president, becomes president. And they finally tell him that they have these bombs. And he had been told, and most people would call it, that they estimated that the Japanese would fight to the death to prevent their country from being taken. And we had a pretty good clue to that effect from Okinawa. What went on in Okinawa?
Kamikaze?
The kamikaze planes. So they knew these people were willing to die that way. So they knew that the women, children, they'd all, sacrifice themselves to do this. So they estimated that close to 1 million American men would probably die taking those things. And then, Truman decided, well, I'm going to take the option of dropping the bomb, and ushered in the atomic age. They dropped the bombs, and the first bomb was on
Nagasaki.
Hiroshima, and what was the name of the plane?
Nola Gay.
Enola Gay. And the second one was on Nagasaki, and I bet you can't guess the name of the plane.
Nola Gay.
Book stock or something like that. It's an interesting one. But the two bombs, and of course the second bomb, Emperor Hirohito went to see and was amazed at what he saw in terms of the damage done, the number killed, and the radiation poisoning and all that. And he told his generals, we are stopping. Now, most people are not aware of the fact that if Hirohito had said, we're going to fight, the United States did not have any more what? Atomic bombs. We used them all. So, fortunately, he decided to surrender unconditionally. And my brother was in California, ready to go in, and then they transferred him to another camp, and they politely told him, the war's over, we don't need you in the military anymore, you're decommissioned at this point, and they said, go home. The interesting thing was, they gave him no way to go home. They didn't give him money, they had no transportation, so my brother said, thank God for long distance truckers. Because he had to thumb it, and he thumbed it all the way into Kansas City, and then somehow he got a ticket. I don't know whether my parents sent it to him or what, and he took a train in there, and eventually he lived up to his dream. He became a printer, and that's what he did for his career. Got married, had children. And I can tell you one other quick little, because we have time.
One other little quick.
My oldest brother, he had, when he was in high school, had met this girl, and he infatuated with her at the stage of the game. But her mother and father were strict Catholic, and he was not. And they told her, you cannot be seen with him, you cannot date him, or none. And so they split at the stage of the game. And then many, many years later, after they both had been married, had their children, and spouses died, and all that type of thing, my brother was living in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and he had a little house, and he was, struggling financially. So he took a job where he was going out in the Goshen the food store, and was taking the carts and bringing them in to the staging area, the stage game. And one day he's out there picking up these carts, and he hears, "Are you Bob Nippus?" And he turned around, and here's this lady. And he didn't recognize her. She said, "I'm Rose." And this was the girl. And, you know, they were both now single, but they were living within a mile of each other. And so they started dating. But Bob, if he went over to watch TV with her, she made him leave at 11 o'clock. And they spent many, many months together of happiness at that stage of the game. But, you know, for a while, my brother had gotten into smoking and drinking alcohol, and it took its toll. And eventually he developed cancer, and eventually died in a hospice, you know, for the Veterans Administration at that stage of the game. But, you know, the only reason why I tell you this story was for Operation Tiger, so that, you know, the government actually hid this for years and didn't allow it to be even discussed until 1988 at this stage of the game. And, you know, it shows what the government can do in terms of trying to keep information from the American people at times at this stage of the game. But at least now you know, if you ever hear Operation Tiger, you know what it is and how horrible it was for all those young men to die, and, you know, didn't even die at the hands of the enemy,
Right.
per se.
And most of them died on mission, on a training mission.
I can't hear you.
That was a training mission.
That was a training mission. But it turned to be nasty.
Oh, yeah.
Any questions?
Any more questions?
Well, I have a couple of minutes here, if I can. Back to the European theater where all these troops were hunkered down and in Bastogne and that forest area. Patton had confiscated a building for older people in, I gotta put a plug in for Luxembourg. It's about half the size of Delaware, a little country that, and they had a long-term facility for older people right in the city of Luxembourg. And Patton went in there and said, "This is gonna be my office." And so all those patients that were in there had to be vacated. And underneath this long-term facility was just tunnels here, there, and everywhere. That's where they would put all kinds of ammunition and food and everything, the supplies, various things that they needed. Well, anyway, eventually, of course, Patton made the decision that with the weather changing and all that kind of stuff, where the Americans were able to defeat the Germans, but that's where he had his headquarters, and it was about a 30-minute drive to the forest area where all of these troops, you've seen it in movies, where they were freezing their feet, arms, everything like that. But that's what happened in Luxembourg.
One other quick one, you know, when Patton was moving rapidly into Germany, and they're still in France, you know, at night, they don't fight. They basically stop fighting at this stage of the game. And Bob said that was a really good time because we would find a vacant French home that the Germans had evacuated in terms of that. And he said, you go down in the basement, you would find this wine cellar. And he said there was some good drinking in terms of, you know, some of those homes that the French had the wine in terms of that.
There's a D-Day monument with like a reenactment down in Bedford, Virginia. If you've ever been to Bedford, Virginia, it's really neat. It's they lost more people per capita in their town than any other town in the whole country. So that's why they were chosen to build this. So,
Speaking of cemeteries and stuff like that, Patton wanted to be buried with his troops. I don't know if you know this or not, but the city of Luxembourg has a cemetery right outside it, a military one, you'd be proud of it, where he was put right up front with all of the monuments that explain the D-Day and all of the various troops, pathways and stuff like that.
Most people are not aware of the fact that Patton was killed, how?
in a car accident.
You know, I think his automobile and Jeep was broadsided as stages of the game.
If we saw the movie, it was a fantastic movie. Okay, what do you think? That was wonderful. I'm sorry for all the technical difficulties,
Yes,
but we'll try to
sorry.
work on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, appreciate it.
This is the Dr. Nippus meeting room. He was the founder of the Historical Society. So that's what we paid honor to him by naming the meeting room Nippus, Dr. Nippus.
Thank you for coming and, keeping the history alive.
I'm so sorry we couldn't make it work, but
Mistakes are gonna be made again.
we tried.
We're all technically challenged.
Yeah.
I'm usually not. That's what the frustrating is.
Perfectly yesterday, so
Yeah, we spent a couple hours to get it to work.
that was yesterday. Thanks for the,
Right,
thanks for
right.
these little cough drops. No, I do have one. I have one in and almost every night before I go to bed, I suck on one because I can cough. Spells. Everything got